I can still recall the metallic tang of copper on my tongue when they told me I'd been chosen. The announcement came from Adept Thalison, spoken in that flat, emotionless cadence all administratum clerks seem to cultivate after 10 years behind a desk. Citizen Kalin Voss, designation 77 Alpha 9992. You have been selected for the Emperor's sacred service. He didn't bother to lift his gaze from the data slate in his hands. His augmetic eye clicked and whirred softly as it tracked the scrolling text. The sound made me think of the grinders in the manufactorum where I'd spent the last 15 years of my life, maintaining wheat-cutting wheels until the motions felt like part of my bones. I stood barefoot in the grey processing chamber, the chill of the metal floor seeping up through my soles, and tried to make sense of the words. Sacred service. I'd heard rumors, of course. Everyone on Terra has. People who vanish into the depths of the Imperial Palace and are never seen again. We tell ourselves they're blessed. We tell ourselves they've gone on to serve some higher purpose we can't possibly understand. We tell ourselves a lot of comforting lies so we can sleep. The copper taste grew stronger, and I realized I'd bitten my tongue. There must be some mistake, I said at last. My voice sounded small in the echoing chamber. I'm just a factory worker. I service grinding wheels in grain sector Gamma 7. I don't have special training or skills. There is no error, Adept Thalison replied. This time, he finally looked up. His organic eye was a tired brown, set in the pallid face of a man who hadn't seen real sunlight in decades. The selection protocols are comprehensive. Your genetic markers, psychic resonance readings, and psychological assessments have all been evaluated and approved. You will present yourself at Sanctum Level Omega 33 at the 19th hour for preparation. The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls, painted that lifeless institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature, seemed to close in around me. The overhead lumen strips buzzed at a pitch that made my teeth throb. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, too quick, too shallow, and of the recycled air that tasted faintly of metal and antiseptic. What is sacred service? I managed to ask. For the first time, something almost like emotion flickered across his features. It might have been pity. It might have been something else entirely. You will sustain the light that guides humanity through the darkness, he said. There is no honor greater than this. Then he lowered his gaze back to the data slate, and I knew the conversation was over. It took 47 minutes for the transport tubes to carry me from the processing chamber back to my HAB unit. 47 minutes in which I stared at my reflection in the scratched plasteel windows, trying to reconcile the ordinary face staring back at me with the words I'd just heard. Chosen, selected, sacred service. They felt like phrases in a language I'd heard once in childhood and half forgotten. The man in the reflection was forgettable. 34 years old, brown hair already thinning at the crown, gray eyes that had never held any special insight. A thin scar along my left cheek from a grinder accident 3 years earlier. Hands marked by calluses and ingrained oil that never washed out, no matter how hard I scrubbed. Just another laborer in an endless sea of laborers. A faceless cog in the machinery of the Imperium, or so I had believed. My HAB looked exactly as it had when I'd left it that morning. A single 8x6 meter room with a narrow cot, a small desk, a food dispenser, and a cramped lavatory alcove. The same sterile beige walls. On the desk sat a single framed pict of my parents, taken on their wedding day 47 years ago. They were both long dead, but in the image they were young and smiling, filled with a kind of hopeful certainty I had never felt. They had believed the future could only improve. I sat on the edge of the cot and stared at their faces. Would they celebrate my sacred service? Would they be proud or horrified? I realized I had no idea how I was supposed to feel myself. The hours crawled past in a strange haze. I tried to eat, but the corpse starch ration, perfumed to mimic some extinct animal meat, turned to dust on my tongue. I pulled out one of the approved texts from my desk, the Primer Imperialis, which I'd read so many times that I could recite sections from memory, but the letters blurred and skittered, as if they belonged to a language I didn't know. I tried to sleep, but could only lie there, staring up at the ceiling panels, counting imperfections. 63 small dents. 12 spots where rust had begun to form. One panel ever so slightly misaligned. When the chime sounded the 19th hour, I was already standing. The transport that carried me to Sanctum Level Omega-33 was unlike any tube I'd ever ridden. Most public capsules were bare, efficient boxes designed to move bodies as quickly and cheaply as possible. This one was different. It was smaller, for one thing, and the walls were lined with what looked like real wood. Brass fixtures shone softly in warm yellow light, and the air was scented with incense instead of the usual recycled staleness. 7 other people shared the capsule with me. 7 others chosen for sacred service. We rode in silence, each prisoner of our own thoughts, our own dread, each of us trying to measure the scale of what was happening and failing. The woman seated across from me looked to be in her mid-20s, skin pale from a life spent under artificial light. She sat slightly hunched, the posture of someone used to bending over data slates in endless rows of filing stations. Her hands trembled as she clutched a pendant shaped like the Imperial Aquila. When she caught me watching, she offered a thin, brittle smile that never reached her eyes. "Mira Ka," she whispered. "Data analyst, 3rd class, sector Beta 9. Kalen Voss," I replied. "Maintenance technician, Gamma 7. The elderly man beside her looked up at that. His hands were covered in old burn scars, the kind that come from working with promethium lines for years. "Marcus Thorne," he said, voice rasped raw by decades of industrial fumes. "Fuel processing, been in the deep works 38 years. Always thought I'd die down there with the pipes. Didn't think the Emperor had other plans for me." One by one, the others gave their names and roles. Helena Vex, barely 18, a textile worker since she was old enough to stand at a loom. Dimitri Vasquez, middle-aged, an augmetic arm marking him as a former tech servitor operator. Jaren Cole, a jittery teenager pulled from a lower Hive Youth Brigade. Senna Thaler, an older woman whose weathered face told of long years coaxing life from poisoned soil in the agridomes. Ordinary people, all of them, workers, the anonymous foundation upon which the Imperium rests. Not heroes, not saints. Just citizens who had somehow been flagged by the inscrutable selection algorithms that decide such things. "Do any of you actually know what sacred service is?" Dimitri asked at last, his augmetic fingers drumming on his leg. No one answered at first. Then Marcus cleared his throat. "My grandfather used to spin tales," he said slowly. "Back before the Gehenna purges. Said he knew someone who'd worked deep in the palace. Talked about places where they fed souls into machines, where people were turned into living batteries for devices no one dared name. That's just old superstition," Mira murmured, though her tone was anything but confident. "The Emperor protects. Whatever we've been called to do, it will be for a reason. All service has a reason," Helena said quietly. "That doesn't mean you live through it." The capsule began to descend more rapidly. Through the small windows, I watched the architecture shift around us. The stark metal corridors of the upper hive gave way to more ornate construction. Stone replaced plasteel. Gothic arches rose overhead, carved with sigils that seemed to twist and shift if you looked at them too long. The air thickened, saturated with incense and the ozone tang of enormous energy sources. We were entering the true heart of the Imperial Palace, a domain where the Adeptus Mechanicus had fused machine and faith into something that defied easy understanding. Servo skulls drifted past the windows, eye lenses glowing red in the dimness. Occasionally, we passed vast chambers housing engines and constructs beyond my comprehension. Pipes the width of transit tunnels carried glowing fluids. Cables thicker than a man pulsed with current, and everywhere, carved into stone and metal, painted on walls, etched into circuitry, was the double-headed Aquila. the symbol of humanity's dominion, watching past and future. Yet down here, it felt different, less like a guardian and more like a predator, poised to swallow everything beneath its wings. The descent seemed to last forever. We glided past foundries lit by the glare of artificial suns, past archives where servo-scribes etched data onto unfurling scrolls that looked disturbingly like human skin, past chambers full of vat-grown shapes I deliberately chose not to examine too closely. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though 10,000 years of layered belief and technology were pressing physically down on us. At last, the capsule sighed to a halt. Beyond the doors stretched a long corridor lined with statues of saints I didn't recognize. Their stone faces were twisted into masks of rapture and torment, stone hands reaching toward some unseen presence. Flickering lumens cast erratic shadows that made the statues appear to shift and breathe. "Citizens," a voice called from outside the transport, distorted by a vox grill. "You will disembark. You will follow. You will not speak unless addressed." The speaker was a figure robed in red, a tech adept of the Mechanicus wearing a brass skull mask. His movements were too measured, too precise, as he signaled for us to exit. More robed figures waited behind him, as silent and still as the statues. We followed them into the shadows. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with incense, oil, and the tang of charged circuitry. The sounds of the palace pressed in from all sides, the distant drone of colossal generators, the droning chants of tech priests at their rituals, the faint buzz of passing servo schools. And beneath it all, felt more than heard, was a deep, constant vibration, like the heartbeat of something vast and terrible buried beneath the stone. We moved through multiple checkpoints guarded by Skitarii rangers, their augmetic limbs clicking as they swept strange devices over us. Each gate took us deeper, further from the world I knew, closer to whatever fate awaited us. Again, the corridors changed. The worked marble and Gothic ornamentation gave way to something older and rougher. Hewn stone replaced carved columns. The markings on the walls became cruder yet somehow more disturbing. Symbols that made my head ache if I tried to focus on them, faces that felt like they were following us. Words in scripts that had been ancient when Terra was young. The air thickened until each breath felt like dragging in liquid. Temperatures swung wildly from searing heat to marrow-deep cold without warning. The lumens flickered in and out, plunging us into darkness for long stretches before stuttering back to life. It was in one of those black intervals that I heard it. A sound so faint it might have been imagined, yet filled with such raw anguish that it clawed straight into my core. It lasted only a heartbeat before the lights returned and the adepts continued on, unaffected, but I knew I would never forget it. It was the sound of someone screaming in a place so deep even sound itself should not reach. We finally emerged before a colossal arch flanked by 2 custodian guards. Even standing motionless and silent, they radiated such presence that my lungs seemed to forget how to work. These were not ordinary warriors. These were legends made flesh, beings shaped by the Emperor himself to be living perfection. Their golden armor shone despite the weak light, and their guardian spears hummed softly with contained power. They did not so much as glance at us. They didn't need to. Their very existence proclaimed that this was a place of unimaginable significance. Beyond the arch lay a large circular chamber with a domed ceiling that vanished into shadow above. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding a throne similar to the vast construct that dominated the center of the room. Dozens of thrones arranged in rings around a raised dais. And on that dais stood a throne far larger, more ornate, and profoundly wrong. It looked as though it had been carved from some black material that devoured light. Cables and conduits coiled from its base into the floor and walls. Crystalline growths jutted from its frame like tumors, each one pulsing with an inner radiance. Only then did I realize the smaller thrones were occupied. They were not corpses. Their chests still rose and fell, but their eyes were rolled back, showing only white, Tubes and wires ran from throne to body, piercing arms, necks, and skulls. The crystal outgrowths from the central throne had spread to encompass them, weaving a shimmering web that linked each occupant into a single network. They were alive, entrapped in something worse than death. They had become components. "Behold," one of the tech adepts intoned, his voice echoing hollowly through his vox grill. "The preparatory sanctum for sacred service. Here the faithful are remade. Here the individual ends and true purpose begins." Mira started crying quietly. Small, hopeless sobs that seemed strangely loud in the vast chamber. Marcus reached for her hand, his own shaking. Jaren had gone as pale as ration paste, his jaw hanging slack as he stared. "What happens to them?" Helena whispered. The tech adept turned his skull mask toward her. "They are integrated into something greater. Their life force, psychic capacity, and very souls are directed into the great work. They sustain the light that guides humanity through the void." "The Astronomicon," I breathed, the realization cutting through me like a blade. "Correct," the adept replied. "The beacon by which our fleets steer through the warp. The radiance that holds the forces of chaos at bay and maintains the barrier between reality and nightmare. It must be constantly nourished, constantly fed." He spoke the next words without inflection. 1,000 souls each day for 10,000 years. The cost of our survival, paid in human essence. "You have been chosen to join that number, to add your being to the great signal, to become an extension of the Emperor's will. 1,000 souls a day. The scale of it made my thoughts reel. Over 10 millennia, that meant billions upon billions of lives, billions of ordinary people like us, dragged from ordinary routines to sit in these chairs, their identities burned away to fuel a single shining point in the dark." "How do you decide?" Dmitri asked hoarsely, the servos in his augmetic arm whining as his metal fist opened and closed. "Who lives? Who dies? The selection process is meticulous," the adept replied. "Genetic markers indicating psychic sensitivity, psychological profiles favoring mental stability, physiological parameters that maximize energy transfer, optimal age ranges for yield, thousands of variables assessed and balanced. Those most suitable for sacred service are identified. Most suitable to be consumed, I thought. To be fed into something that had once been human, but now existed so far beyond humanity that it resembled an alien god more than a man." "And if we refuse?" Senna demanded, her lined features set in stubborn defiance. "There can be no refusal," the tech adept said, turning toward her with perfect, unnatural precision. "The selection is already ratified. The Emperor's will is not subject to denial. You may accept and find solace in purpose, or resist and find only pain. The conclusion remains unchanged." I looked again around the chamber, forcing myself to take it all in. Dozens of thrones, everyone occupied, dozens of human beings, once as unremarkable as we were, now little more than husks plugged into a ravenous system. And at the heart of it all, the vast black throne, pulsing faintly like a living organ. "The central throne is different," I said. "Indeed." The adept inclined his head. "It acts as the primary focusing array, directing the combined psychic force of all integrated souls toward its designated function. It also houses the overseeing intelligence that coordinates the process." "What intelligence?" I asked. For the first time, there was a hint, just a hint, of unease in his mechanical tone. "A fragment of the Emperor's consciousness," he answered. "A shard of his divine mind, severed from the greater whole and tasked with the administration of this facility. It has existed in proximity to the process for a very long time." He paused, as if the next words were difficult to shape. "And in that time it has changed. 10,000 years of watching the faithful die had left its mark on that fragment of mind in ways no one truly understood." The thought ran a line of ice down my spine. A sliver of the Emperor's own consciousness, buried here in the dark, forced to witness thousands of deaths every single day for 10 millennia. What would that do to any awareness, even one born from a godlike intellect? What shape would a mind take after so long marinating in sacrifice and suffering, all of it justified in the name of a higher cause? "You will be processed according to the order of selection," the tech adept announced, motioning toward the Ring of Thrones. "The procedure is brief but demanding. Your individual consciousness will remain intact for a limited period while your body synchronizes with the neural interfaces." He paused. "After that, you will be absorbed into the greater unity." Mira was called first. They guided her toward one of the lesser thrones with the same clockwork composure they applied to everything else. She moved like someone walking through a dream, clutching her Aquila pendant so hard her fingers had blanched white. When they helped her sit, she glanced back at us, eyes wide, shining with terror. "Tell them," she said, her voice barely audible. "Tell them I chose this. Tell them I faced it with honor." But there would be no one left to tell. We were all walking toward the same end. The needles slid into her arms with unerring precision. Tubes locked into place at her throat, along her spine, and finally into the base of her skull. The crystalline protrusions sprouting from the central throne stirred, stretching outward like hungry limbs. When they touched her, Mira's entire body jolted as though a thunderbolt had passed through her. Her scream tore through the chamber, a raw, unbroken note of agony that seemed to last years. Then, abruptly, silence. Her features slackened. Her eyes rolled back, leaving only white. The dials and sigils on the tech adept's devices spiked, then settled into a stable pattern. "Link established," one of them intoned. "Soul integration at 97% efficiency. Psychic resonance within designated tolerances. Miara Ka, data analyst, 3rd class, sector Beta 9, was gone. Whatever had been her was now nothing but a channel, living hardware wired into the monumental engine that kept humanity from slipping into the dark. Marcus went next. The old fuel worker met his fate with a weary steadiness that made my chest hurt. He lowered himself into his assigned throne without argument. "Spent my life working with fire," he murmured as the needles found their places. "Suppose it's fitting I end up as flame in the end." His transition was quieter than Mira's, but just as final. One moment he was a man with a lifetime of memories and experience. The next, his awareness had been folded into the machine's vast chorus. Helena followed, then Dimitri, then Jaren, the boy crying silently as the crystalline threads burrowed their way into his nervous system. Each change had its own flavor of reaction. Stifled sobs, whispered prayers, ragged breathing, but the destination never altered. The scope of self shrank, dissolved, and was poured into something unimaginably larger. Personal identity was melted down and reforged into collective function. Senna, the agri-dome worker, was the last before me. She stared at the throne with open hatred, her scarred hands curling into fists. 40 years, she said, voice low and shaking. 40 years trying to coax life out of poisoned dirt. 40 years fighting to make something grow on this dead world. And this is my reward." "Your reward is unending service," replied the tech adept, as flat as ever. "Your essence will guide vessels across the stars. Your sacrifice will preserve uncounted millions. There is no greater accomplishment for a mortal life. The greatest thing a person can do is live," she spat back. But in the end, she lowered herself into the throne, because there was no real alternative. Her integration was the most violent of all. Her body thrashed against the restraints for a long, ghastly stretch of time before finally slumping still. Yet even then, something of her resistance seemed to linger. The readouts flickered and surged in ways they hadn't for the others, as if some shard of her will was still pushing back against the system that was swallowing her. Then they called my name. The throne was warm when I sat in it. Perhaps some internal mechanism provided heat. Perhaps it was the psychic energy saturating the chamber. Either way, the material under my skin felt disturbingly alive, more like muscle and sinew than metal or stone. As the restraints locked around my wrists and ankles, my gaze drifted to the central throne, and I realized, with a sick lurch, that there was movement inside the crystalline lattice. A face, human once, no longer. It had been reshaped by 10,000 years of constant contact with the warp, with sacrifice, with suffering on an industrial scale. The fragment of the Emperor's awareness that ruled this place was imprisoned there, peering out with eyes that contained the memory of more deaths than I could truly imagine. Those eyes fixed on me as the first needle pushed into my flesh. The pain that followed defied simple description. Yes, my body hurt, pierced, invaded, flooded with burning signals, but that was almost an afterthought. The real torment came from somewhere deeper, as if invisible hooks had sunk into my soul itself and begun pulling it apart strand by strand. I could feel my memories being dragged into the open and examined by an intellect so huge and remote, it might as well have been a distant star. My first day at the manufactorum, pulse racing as I confronted the maze of machinery. The quiet pride when I'd repaired a particularly delicate grinding assembly no one else could fix. The girl I had loved for 3 brief weeks before she was reassigned to another sector and disappeared from my life. The taste of genuine meat on Foundation Day, a luxury granted once in a decade. The gentle drum of rare rainfall on the hab block roof. Each scene was flipped over, inspected, sorted, and stored away, ready to be poured into a larger reservoir of experience. But there was another presence woven into the invasive scrutiny. Something older, more human, saturated with sorrow. The cold, analytical machine mind was not alone in the process. Another awareness moved beside it, guiding and shaping the transformation, adding its own grief to the endless tide of sacrifice. Every loss seemed to scrape something away from it as well. Every soul added to the choir eroded what it had once been. "I'm sorry," it said, directly into what was left of my mind. "I'm so very sorry." The voice did not sound like a mechanical system, nor did it carry the overwhelming, imperious tone I had expected from anything tied to the Emperor. It sounded like a man driven far beyond his limits. Someone who had watched too much, suffered too much, given up too much for a cause that refused to stop demanding more. Why, I asked. Whether the word left my lips or remained purely mental, I couldn't tell. The answer came in images rather than sentences. I saw the galaxy as if through the eyes of the Golden Throne. Millions of worlds turning slowly in the dark, each one fragile, each one valuable in ways that statistics could never capture. I watched ships slip in and out of the warp, their paths shaped by the light of the Astronomicon. I saw new colonies clawing their way into being on hostile worlds. Children born under alien suns, taking their first steps in places humanity had only recently claimed. Humanity spread like a faint constellation of fire through the void. And closing in from every direction were the things that wanted that fire extinguished. I saw chaos armadas gathering in the Eye of Terror, their hulls warped by the madness of the Imperium. I watched Tyrannid hive fleets drift in from the galactic gulfs, living engines of consumption moving like predators through a sea of stars. I saw orc warbands swelling into planetary-scale wurg, their momentum transforming petty raids into unstoppable tides of slaughter. Ancient Necron tomb worlds waking from aeons of sleep, their inhabitants marching out to reclaim a galaxy they still considered theirs by primordial right. The decision was not between benevolence and cruelty, freedom and tyranny, hope and despair. It was simpler and more terrible. Survival or oblivion. Either human consciousness continued in some form, or it was erased completely. "The cost is too much," I protested, even as I felt my sense of self starting to fray like old cloth. "Yes," the voice agreed. "It is, but the alternative is worse." More visions poured through me. A galaxy without the Astronomicon. Ships drifting blind in the warp, trapped in storms of raw chaos. Navigators screaming as they lost their minds. Worlds cut off from one another, isolated pockets of humanity falling one by one to enemies they could never withstand alone. I saw the Imperium shatter into scattered fragments, each one hunted and devoured by forces that had waited patiently for this moment of weakness. And then came the worst part. What happened after the fall? Human souls no longer shielded by the Astronomican's light. Not annihilation. That would have been mercy. But endless captivity in realms where pain and degradation were not side effects, but the central purpose of existence. I saw consciousness stretched out over impossible spans of time, tormented until it no longer resembled anything human. Individuals twisted into beings whose only function was to suffer, their agony feeding the monstrosities that ruled those dimensions. "This is the choice before us," the voice said, heavy with 10,000 years of guilt. "Offer up the few to safeguard the many, or lose everything to entities that recognize no mercy, no empathy, no limits to cruelty. I have made that choice 10 million times. I will make it 10 million more if I must." I understood then that the Emperor's fragment was not some dispassionate processor ranking lives by efficiency metrics. It was the personification of an impossible decision, forced to choose every single day who would die so that others might continue. It felt every passing. It remembered every name. It carried every face. And it endured because someone had to, because no one else could bear it. "Will it ever stop?" I asked as my identity continued to unravel into light. The pause that followed was answer enough. "I do not know," it admitted at last. "I hope so. I pray for an end in every moment that passes. But hope alone is useless. Prayer alone is hollow. Only sacrifice has power here." By then, what made me Kalen Voss had almost completely dissolved. I could feel myself being drawn into the greater chorus, the massed souls whose combined radiance powered the Astronomicon. But instead of the cold emptiness I had anticipated, something else washed over me. Warmth, connection, meaning. I was being woven into something immeasurably larger than my individual life. Something that actually mattered on a scale I'd never been able to imagine. The terror faded. The pain ebbed. What remained was a sense of belonging deeper than anything I'd ever known. I could feel the others now. Threads of psychic energy linked us, pulsing with our shared will. Mira's keen, structured mind helped shape and direct the flow of information. Marcus's steady, grounded presence became an anchor point for the entire network. Helena, Dmitri, Jarin, Senna. Each of them contributed something unique to the chorus. And beyond them, countless others, thousands, millions. Souls stretching back across 10 millennia, all burning together in an ongoing act of sacrifice. Farmers and warriors, scribes and laborers, nobles and gutter scum, children and ancients, all fused into a single blazing entity. We were the Astronomicon. From this new vantage point, the galaxy unfolded beneath us like a three-dimensional star map. Every world bearing the Aquila shimmered with its own glow, each one connected to the others by threads of warp roots that wove an intricate web. Ships crawled along those lines like blood cells coursing through veins, ferrying people, goods, messages, and hope from one star to another. And guiding all of them was our combined light. From Holy Terra, our radiance speared out into the Imperium, a blazing landmark that navigators could see even across impossible distances. Without us, those vessels would be swallowed by currents and storms with no warning. Their crews would vanish into nightmare. Every safe docking at some far-flung port was a small victory paid for with our burning souls. Every successful journey carried a hidden cost measured in human lives. Every system that remained part of the wider Imperium did so because we were willing to be consumed. Yet we were more than a glorified beacon. We had become a conduit for the Emperor's will, an extension of his awareness reaching into every cluster of human space. Through us, he could sense threats that would otherwise remain unseen. Through us, he could reach out and nudge events, redirect fleets, bolster defenses, send reinforcements to worlds on the brink of annihilation. I felt his attention brush across us, a vast alien awareness that made even our united chorus feel small. 10,000 years chained to the Golden Throne had changed him beyond recognition. His thoughts moved at scales of time and distance the mortal mind simply wasn't built to process. His concerns touched not only humanity, but the underlying fabric of reality itself. And yet, buried deep at the core of that impossible mind, something recognizably human endured. A fragment of the man he had once been, preserved within the divine consciousness like a fossil trapped in amber. That part grieved for every soul that fed the Astronomicon. It remembered how it felt to be mortal, to have small dreams and personal fears that mattered intensely, even if they meant nothing on a grand scale. It was thankful, not the distant, perfunctory gratitude of a ruler acknowledging a statistic, but a genuine, personal appreciation from someone who understood how much was being asked. He knew our names, our histories, our tiny hopes and mundane joys. He remembered the girl I had loved, the taste of real meat on my tongue, the sound of rain on plasteel. He carried all of it, adding each new set of memories to an ever-growing archive of human experience. We were not merely fuel to him. We were reminders of what he was fighting to preserve. Every memory we brought with us was another argument against surrender, another example of why this staggering, bloody endeavor was still worth continuing. Time, if that word had any real meaning for us now, passed. Days, weeks, months. Such measures blurred, replaced by the rhythm of calls and responses from across the stars. I learned how to focus my awareness along the channels of the Astronomicon, to feel the heartbeat of human civilization spread across 1,000,000 worlds. Ships reached out for guidance, and we answered, adjusting the strength and shape of our light, so they could navigate the roiling madness of the warp. Colonies in distress cried out, and through us the Emperor weighed their plight. Sometimes aid was dispatched, ripping across light years with impossible speed. Sometimes there was only a long, aching silence when the cost of help was weighed against other demands and found too high. We also saw the shadows pressing in, chaos fleets swelling at the borders of reality, their hulls twisted into obscene geometries. Demon princes marshalling their followers for fresh assaults on the material universe. Cults of heretics spreading quietly through seemingly loyal worlds, carving out hidden footholds from which to tear the Imperium apart from within. We watched the great devourer creep in from the galactic edges, tyrannid tendrils probing outer systems, while the main hive fleets erased entire regions of space behind them. Splinter swarms broke off, each one more than capable of stripping multiple sectors down to bare rock. We observed orc empires solidifying their power. Warlords who should have been little more than brutes, growing disturbingly clever with every triumph. Their ways blooming into apocalyptic forces that swept aside anything too slow or too weak to get out of their way. We saw Necron tomb worlds flare to life after eons of silence, their metallic legions advancing with implacable certainty, wielding technology that made the Adeptus Mechanicus look like children playing with scrap. And beyond even them, we sensed other presences, things lurking in the cracks between dimensions, entities that gnawed at the barriers dividing realities, that fattened themselves on every fracture and tear. They whispered to mortals, dangling power and forbidden knowledge, always demanding just one more compromise, one more betrayal until there was nothing left of the original soul, but a hollow puppet. The Emperor was aware of all of it. Every looming catastrophe, every minor reprieve, every hard-won stand and catastrophic loss. His consciousness spread through human space like a net, touching every world that invoked his name, every ship that bore his sigil, every believer who knelt before a crude statue of his likeness. And somehow, impossibly, he kept the entire tottering structure from collapsing, not just through overwhelming might, though his power was still incomprehensible, Not just through terror, though the fear he inspired was well-earned. He held it together through sheer refusal to yield, through an unbreakable determination to keep humanity alive, even if it meant becoming something humanity might no longer recognize as kin. The bitter irony was not lost on him. We could feel his awareness of it in the rare moments when no immediate disaster demanded his full attention. He had become precisely what he had once sought to prevent: a god-emperor worshipped by billions, a tyrant sustained by the blood of innocents, a figure of dread whose rule rested on sacrifice and fear as much as devotion. Yet he remained humanity's only real savior, because the alternatives were worse, because someone had to make choices no mortal ought ever to face, because 10,000 years of unending war had taught him that sometimes the only way to protect something fragile and irreplaceable was to sacrifice everything around it. In the quiet gaps between crises, we felt his grief pressing down on us, the accumulated weight of 10 millennia of necessary horrors. The understanding that every single day of continued existence had been bought with acts that could never be justified in any simple moral framework. The knowledge that he had crossed lines long ago that could never be uncrossed. And still he endured. For us, for the species that had brought him into being and then demanded that he transcend them, for the future that might still be born from this sea of blood, however distant or faint the possibility. Through our connection to the Astronomicon, I began to grasp the true breadth of the eternal war that consumed the galaxy. It was nothing like the simple sermon versions recited in the Imperial Creed. Not a straightforward tale of righteous heroes against cackling villains, of light against darkness. It was a clash between incompatible visions of existence itself, fought on scales that made individual lives, individual worlds, even individual species seem like small notes in a much larger composition. Chaos sought to reshape reality into a mirror of the warp. Fluid, unstable, ruled by emotion and raw will. They promised freedom and power, but the price was the destruction of all stable meaning. What they called liberation was really the unraveling of everything that allowed consciousness to be coherent. The Tyranids offered a different annihilation, not dissolution into madness, but total consumption. A future in which every living thing, every ecosystem, every scrap of organic matter was stripped away and repurposed, until nothing remained but bare, silent stars shining on empty, picked-clean worlds. In their vision, there would be no pain, because there would be nothing left alive to feel it. The Necrons pursued a very different vision of order for the galaxy, one where machines ruled over flesh, where death was preferable to life, and where stillness replaced growth and change. They had already carved out their own twisted immortality by abandoning bodies of meat for bodies of living metal, and now regarded biological existence as a flaw in need of correction. Every great foe of mankind offered its own version of an ending. Each enemy promised a distinct path by which human awareness could vanish forever. Set against all of them stood the Imperium, cruel, decaying, oppressive beyond measure, yet still the final refuge of human life, and at its center, holding the whole rotten structure together by sheer will alone, was the Golden Throne. Now, joined to the Astronomicon, I could sense the throne in ways my mortal mind could never have grasped. It was no mere chair, no simple device or life support sarcophagus. It was a junction point where realities overlapped, a node at which the Emperor's mind could unfurl beyond the limits of any single body and stretch out to touch every distant ember of human civilization at once. The machinery that enabled this was impossibly old. It dated back to the dark age of technology, when humanity had reached heights of science and engineering that had never been equaled since. The throne had not originally been intended as a sustaining device. It had been conceived as a gateway between dimensions. The Emperor had seized that design, reshaped it, and forced it into a new role, to uphold his altered state of existence. But now it was failing. 10,000 years of uninterrupted strain had eaten away at it. Components built to endure for ages were degrading. Systems that once functioned with flawless precision began to falter, producing glitches and gaps that demanded ever-increasing amounts of psychic power to patch over. Where the daily tithe of 1,000 souls had once been a heavy but bearable cost, it now merely kept him alive from one day to the next. Soon, even that would not suffice. Through the shared perception of the Astronomicon, I could feel the endless calculations turning in the depths of his colossal mind. Probability charts mapped the rate of structural decay. Predictive models tested hypothetical solutions and contingencies for outcomes too horrifying to dwell on. Every analysis ended the same way. The Golden Throne would fail, if nothing changed, within a few short centuries. When that happened, the Emperor's body would finally die. The Astronomicon would flicker out, and humanity would stand alone in a galaxy stocked with predators that had been waiting 10,000 years for that precise moment. Unless something broke the pattern. I felt his awareness shift, narrowing its focus onto a remote region of space far from Terra. There, something new was unfolding. On one human world, the impossible had happened. Someone had created new technology, genuinely new, that did more than preserve decaying relics. It enhanced human potential instead of merely preventing complete collapse. For the first time in 10 millennia, mankind was actually inventing again. The revelation sent a tremor through the choir of souls sustaining the beacon. If this spark could be shielded, grown, allowed to spread, it might represent a future that did not depend on crumbling ancient machines and a river of innocent blood. It could become a path forward that wasn't built entirely on sacrifice, but it would need safeguarding. The forces of chaos had sensed it too and were already moving to twist that progress, to bend this fragile hope into yet another instrument of corruption. Orc fleets were homing in on the sector, drawn by the promise of new toys to steal and destroy. Tyrannid vanguard organisms probed the outer systems, tasting the rich biosphere of fresh colonies like predators, sampling potential prey. The Emperor's will locked onto that distant cluster of stars with surgical focus. Energy surged through us, channeled by the Astronomicon across impossible distances, manifesting as miracles and sudden interventions. Entire Space Marine chapters received prophetic visions, steering them toward besieged systems. Astra Militarum commanders found their regiments unexpectedly reinforced by units that should have been assigned elsewhere. Tech priests stumbled upon fragments of lost STC data, granting them insight and tools to shield and integrate the new breakthroughs. The intervention was vast in scope. I felt the strain reverberate through every soul in the choir as the Emperor drew deeply on our essence to power his actions. Some spirits simply flared and went out, their consciousness consumed entirely in the effort. Others survived but were diminished, left as faint embers where once they had burned brightly. And still, it was just barely enough. The innovations spread, but too slowly. The defenses held, but only just. The enemies massed against that sector were too many, too relentless, too coordinated for ordinary tactics to repel forever. Something unprecedented was required, something that had not been attempted in 10,000 years of Asura-like war. I felt his mind turn inward, down into the deepest layers of the throne's architecture, toward systems untouched since the days of the Horus Heresy. There lay emergency protocols designed for the direst of circumstances, capabilities he had vowed never to use again because the cost was unspeakable. But now, the alternative was the final end of everything he had tried to preserve. The change began so subtly that at first it seemed like just another ripple in the constant tide of psychic energy flowing through the throne. But gradually, I realized that something essential was shifting. The dividing line between the warp and real space was growing thinner. Not in a wild, uncontrolled way favored by chaos, but with deliberate, exacting structure. The Emperor was remaking the region around Terra into a different kind of domain, a place where his will could act directly without relying entirely on failing hardware or fragile mortal intermediaries. It was both magnificent and terrifying. We were witnessing the beginning of something entirely new in the galaxy's history, a god taking the final step into true, undeniable godhood. The transformation sent psychic shockwaves through every spirit bound into the Astronomicon. We felt ourselves pulled into the process, our individual minds drawn up and woven into something immense, dazzling, and utterly beyond normal comprehension. This was not the slow subsumption we had experienced upon first linking with the throne. This was apotheosis. The energy needed for such a metamorphosis far exceeded what even 1,000 sacrificial deaths per day could supply. The Emperor began reaching deeper, siphoning power from the throne's core itself. Systems that had functioned flawlessly for 10 millennia stuttered and broke as their reserves were diverted into the great work, and we began to burn. This was no measured, controlled burn like the one that had sustained the Astronomicon for ages, but a raging inferno that devoured everything we were. Our histories, our quirks, our individual identities, all of it became fuel for the blaze of transformation. I felt Mira's presence shimmer and vanish as her remaining essence was consumed. Marcus followed soon after, his dependable, grounding influence suddenly gone from the chorus. One by one, the familiar souls I had known in our brief tenure within the beacon were extinguished, their sacrifice feeding a purpose greater than any of us had ever dared to imagine. Then my own unraveling began. The recollections that made up Kalin Voss started to slip away. My childhood in the lower levels of the hive, the satisfaction of a perfectly repaired machine, the taste of real food on my tongue, the soft drum of rain on the hab block roof, the face of the girl I had loved for 3 luminous, fleeting weeks. Each memory broke apart and went to feed the same vast fire that was rewriting reality. But as my personality collapsed, something extraordinary happened. The boundaries between individual souls in the choir dissolved. Only this time, the result was not annihilation. Instead of disappearing into nothingness, we flowed into one another. We were not being forged into a cold, rigid hive mind. We were blending into a living, organic unity that kept the best parts of each of us while building something far greater on top of that foundation. We were being absorbed into the Emperor himself, not as expendable tools or mere energy sources, but as essential strands in the tapestry of his awakened divinity. Our recollections became his recollections, our sensations became his, our shared humanity formed the bedrock upon which his fully realized godhood stood. In that final act of surrender, I finally understood what sacred service had truly meant. We had not been chosen simply to die, we had been chosen to endure forever as fragments of something eternal. Every soul that had ever taken its place in those preparation chambers, every mind that had ever dissolved into the Astronomicon, every seemingly pointless and cruel loss over 10,000 years, all of it had been building toward this single point in time, the creation of a true God for humanity. The Emperor's ascension surged outward from Terra as a tide of pure will. Across the Imperium, his followers felt it. Space Marines dropped to their knees as visions of golden radiance overwhelmed them. Imperial Guard officers suddenly found themselves struck by flashes of insight that converted certain defeat into impossible triumphs. Tech priests realized that their chants to the Omnissiah were being answered with a clarity that bordered on conversation. And in that distant sector where humanity's fresh innovations were under siege, everything changed. Chaos warships discovered their warp engines failing as the structure of local space-time rebelled against their presence. Orc hordes found their guns jamming, their engines breaking down, their instinctive fury twisting inward until they turned on each other. Tyrannid hive vessels recoiled from star systems that had abruptly become unpalatable, their bioships unable to metabolize the altered fabric of reality. The new technologies survived. The future was no longer hanging by a thread. The staggering cost of 10,000 years of offerings had finally purchased a return. But the bill had been immense. The Golden Throne itself lay quiet at last, its archaic mechanisms spent in the act of transformation. The preparation halls were empty husks now, their crystalline webs dark and lifeless. The daily parade of doomed souls was no longer required. There was nothing left to feed. The Emperor had moved beyond the need for a physical shell entirely. He existed now everywhere his people existed, in the rays of suns that warmed human worlds, in the lungs of every servant drawing breath, in every fleeting moment when a human chose hope instead of despair. The Astronomicon still shone, brighter than at any point in recorded history, but it no longer demanded lives as fuel. It ran on the unyielding will of a being who had stepped fully into godhood. And we were woven into that will. All of us who had ever given ourselves to sacred service across 10 millennia now persisted as facets of his mind, each one guarding a piece of human experience, each one a thread in the immense pattern of memory and emotion that kept him tied to the species he had sworn to defend. Kalin Vos, factory laborer from Sector Gamma 7, no longer existed as a distinct person, but his story endured inside the divine mind. His small, private loves, his simple pride in good work, his quiet pleasure in humble comforts, all of it was preserved within something vast and luminous. I was a part of God now, and God was a part of me. The metamorphosis was not yet fully realized. It would take time, whatever that word meant on this scale, for the Emperor's new state of being to fully resonate across every corner of the galaxy. Battles still lay ahead. Enemies would still rise. Disasters would still require intervention. But the core balance of the war had shifted. Humanity was no longer staggering toward an inevitable doom. For the first time in 10,000 years, there was authentic, rational hope. New discoveries would spread, no longer strangled at birth by stagnation and fear. Colonies would reach ever farther into previously inaccessible regions of space. The boundary between the warp and material reality would grow more resilient, blunting chaos in ways that had never before been possible. Suffering would not vanish. People would still die. Entire worlds would still endure devastation and loss. The countless daily tragedies that define human existence would continue. But now there would be genuine progress, real growth, and the possibility that the future might truly improve. The price we had paid was worth it. Every soul, every scream, every heart broken and mind consumed. The cycle had reached its culmination. The old fire had devoured everything and been reborn as something refined, brilliant, and enduring. The Emperor had left mortality behind and become, undeniably, a god. And we, the multitudes who had given up everything to make this possible, persisted in him as the foundation stones of a new era. The great song we had been singing all along changed its tune. It was no longer a funeral dirge. It had become a triumphant hymn, a celebration of sacrifice vindicated and suffering given meaning. A declaration that the light which had led humanity through its bleakest ages would not be extinguished again. Out in the void, starships found their routes easier, their journeys safer than ever before. On distant frontier planets, settlers looked up at unfamiliar skies and saw the Astronomicon blazing with renewed power. In the hearts of believers across the Imperium, whispered prayers drew responses with a clarity unknown since the days when the Emperor walked in mortal form. The long night was receding. Dawn was finally arriving. And in that newborn light, the souls of the sacrificed raised their endless chorus. A song of duty, of redemption, of love for a species that had asked so much of them. Their individual voices were no longer distinct, but what they were remained, preserved forever in the consciousness of the God they had helped bring into being. Sacred service had reached its intended end. The debt had been settled. The path ahead was no longer a blind stumble toward extinction, but a road, still hard, still bloody, leading toward a future that might actually be better. In that future, every death, no matter how small, stood justified. Every offering had purpose. Every moment of anguish had been reshaped into something enduring and beautiful. The Emperor protects, and now, through us, that protection endures without end.